Thank you so much, Cliff. The topic you asked me to address today is under the title, Congress, Is It Working? And I was a little puzzled, Cliff. I didn't know whether you were talking about is it functioning or are we putting in long, strenuous hours? If it's the latter, we're doing that. If it's functioning, no. We clearly are not functioning. And the fact is, we are now into the second week after the end of the fiscal year, operating under what's called a continuing resolution. That's to continue funding, and still trying to address the question of getting appropriation bills cleared, and if there's going to be a tax component, as our Democrat leadership insists there must be, trying to get that through Congress and get out of here in time for the elections. Now that's a big order. The fact is that we established rules governing the operation of this body and the Senate back in 1974. And under those rules, the President is required the first Monday after January 3rd to submit a budget, the President's budget, to Congress. Now, we all remember the jokes about Reagan's budgets coming to the Hill dead on arrival when they got here. And I think that's not far from the truth, and that's been a rather consistent policy, and not inappropriately so for this reason. All of the general appropriation bills in our history have always originated in the House, and all tax bills constitutionally must originate in the House. And as a result, if you've got taxation on the one hand and you've got spending on the other, you originate all policy, and you arrange the priorities. Now, to be sure, the Senate, if it is in disagreement with the House, can force some compromise, but the thrust is still emanating from the House. And the President, through the exercise of the veto, if he is sustained, can force the Congress to sit down at the negotiating table with him and make some compromises. If he's overridden, he's overridden. I mean, that's the way the system is set up. If there is such an overwhelming mandate in the Congress in disagreement with the President, the Congress will prevail. And after all, the House of Representatives, the Founding Fathers created to be the body closest to the people. That's why they put that tax authority here. Our independence movement focused on taxation without representation as tyranny, and they wanted to give the voters of this country the most immediate control, since all of us, 100% in the House, are up for re-election every 2 years. They wanted that control directly in the hands of the people. Now, after the President submits his budget, though, our rules since 1974 require the Congress to come up with its budget recommendations and to submit those to the committees of jurisdiction, for them in turn to get active authorizing and appropriating, and to have all of that process finished, all of the appropriation bills cleared the House by June 30th. Now, since 1974, when we established those guidelines, we have never once met the deadlines, never once. I said that our rules here governing this House are our domestic laws, if you will. But the laws that we pass for you folks out in the private sector, if you choose to violate them with the casual disregard this Congress shows for its domestic rules, you're going to go to jail, or at least you're going to go to court and probably pay a very substantial fine. It is such a perverse violation of what we are imposing on people throughout this entire nation on the one hand, but it sets, I think, a very bad example, and it creates the kind of crisis that we're in at the present time, when we got through September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, and we had not cleared one single appropriation bill for a department of government through the House and the Senate and presented it to the President. So, as I say, Congress clearly is not functioning. Now, trying to analyze some of the reasons why. If you go back historically, the Ways and Means Committee on which I serve had not only the function of raising the taxes, but also determining expenditure levels. That's where the title came from. We had to figure out the ways and means of balancing income and outgo. We also had the budget function. In this modern era, we have divorced the budget function. We have a separate budget committee, and to be sure, one member of Ways and Means holds a position on that committee from the minority and one from the majority. But we also created a separate appropriations committee, one of the biggest ones because it has jurisdiction over ultimately determining appropriation levels for all of the committees of jurisdiction over the respective departments of government. They have, in effect, on appropriations, become the Santa Clauses, and we on the Ways and Means Committee play Scrooge. It's our function to say, after we've determined how much they're going to spend, how we will raise the taxes to get in balance. And obviously that's created a grave imbalance in the system because I came here in '69. That was the last year our budget was in surplus. Very modest, as I recall, it was about $3 billion. And we have consistently run deficits every year since that time, and now we've got to the staggering deficit levels of over $200 billion in a single year. And there are some projections that within a couple of years out, if one gives honest budgetary figures, it could be in the $300 to $400 billion range of deficit. I think it's important in this same context to realize that it took us from 1789 to 1943, the height of World War II, to get to the awesome level of $100 billion of national debt. And I remember the roaring debate we had on the floor of the House in 1975 over the advisability of letting our national debt go beyond $500 billion. And H.R. Gross, who was one of our crusty old curmudgeons out of Iowa and a fiscal tightwad, he took to the floor ranting and raving about this level of irresponsibility, and he said, why, at this rate, it could reach $1 trillion before the end of the century. I met with some grammar school youngsters in my district this spring, and I told them that when I was their age, I learned the same funny words that they've learned: million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, and so forth. And I said I never had the occasion to use that word trillion from the time I was their age until 1981. And that's when our national debt did reach the trillion figure, just 6 years after Congressman Gross's warning. And then it took us only 4 years after that, 1985, to get to 2 trillion. And today we're at well over 3 trillion, and the projections are, even if we hit the Graham-Rudman targets for a balance by 1993, we'd still be adding somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 more trillion to our national debt. Now, Ev Dirksen, one of our very popular former senators from Illinois, used to joke, a billion here, a billion there, it begins to add up to real money. Today you can revise that, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, begins to add up to real money. One of the sad things about the magnitude of our debt is these figures are beyond human comprehension. Nobody can grasp the concept of $1 trillion, but to put it in focus for you, if you started a business at the time of Christ and you stayed open 7 days a week, 365 days a year, from Christ's time to the present moment, and from that very first day you opened your new business, you lost $1 million, and you kept losing $1 million every day in your business from Christ's time to the present moment, it would still take you another 700 years before you could lose your first $1 trillion. And that's the magnitude of debt that we're passing on to my kids and my grandchildren now. I am blessed by having 2 grandsons from my oldest daughter, and thus I have more than a casual interest in the next century. And I guarantee you that we are squandering the future, we are heaping potential disaster upon the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren because of this current irresponsibility, because Congress is not functioning. Now, I want to warn you in advance, I am a conservative Republican, but I do not intend this to be a partisan debate. But let me tell you, back in January of 1987, when Jim Wright had just been installed as new Speaker of the House, he went before his Democrat caucus and he urged them to push through a $65 billion tax increase. And many of his Democratic chairmen of committees demurred because they said, you know, the Republicans beat up on us as being the big taxers. And he responded, Jim Wright responded by saying, sure, the Republicans accuse us of being the party of tax and spend. We are, he said. That's why people sent us here. Now, I think it's revealing because there is truth in what Jim Wright had to say. I've said I'd love to be on the hustings campaigning against an opponent who gets up before an audience and says, vote for me and I'll tax you and I'll spend your money. That's not what Jim was talking about. What the Speaker was talking about was redistribution of income. And the system, from his perspective, is designed to do exactly that. You take from the haves and you give it to the have-nots. And that's why they have insisted they're the party representing the poor and the lower income folks, and the Republicans are the party representing the rich. You hear that debate going on right now on this budget issue. But what Jim was talking about was you identify what presumably are Republican constituencies, and that's first business. And secondly, now he's down to probably a cutoff point of about $35,000 a year. Anybody making over $35,000 is rich and Republican. So you sock it to them with a tax increase and you redistribute it to the people with their hands out, whom he identifies as part of the natural Democrat constituency. And this is what has brought us to the impasse at which we find ourselves today. While on the one hand, to be sure, the Democrats would like to redistribute income, we are at such an impasse in terms of this budget irresponsibility that we have reached an effective stalemate. The American people have had taxes up to here. The truth of the matter is, you look at poll after poll after poll, and voters say they do not want resolution of our problems with tax increases. They want it resolved by a reduction in spending. And I think President Bush was right on target in '88 when he called for the flexible freeze. A flexible freeze on departments of government would permit rearrangement of priorities within those budgetary constraints, but the flexible freeze would enable us, the guesstimates are right now, to reach a balance within about 3 years' time without having to resort to tax increases. And frankly, I was dismayed when the Democrats forced him to make concessions during these negotiations. I think it's important, though, when one gets to a sufficient level of frustration watching the mismanagement of this Congress, watching us heading into an election where probably we're destined to get a lame duck session so that nobody has to vote on the issues of taxation or cutbacks in spending, especially to the elderly. Put that off until they get through the election, come back for a lame duck, and then wrap it up. That, to me, is the height of irresponsibility and unaccountability. But when I get filled with sufficient frustration, I remind myself of Alexander Hamilton's quote. And Hamilton said, and it's true, people get the kind of government they deserve. And so who is to blame for this? If you look at the last presidential election year, we only got a 50% vote turnout. Normally, in off years like we're headed into now, 35% vote turnout. What that means is a committed, organized 18% can control these vital institutions of government. And I say vital institutions. I would focus first and foremost on the House. We have a tendency as Republicans to get elated by capturing the White House, but the fact of the matter is this is where the ball game begins and this is where the ball game ends, because of that power to initiate those general appropriation bills and taxes. And with that, Cliff, I'd be happy to try in the time we have remaining, because I've got to get on to the White House right after we break. The Ways and Means minority is meeting with President Bush for an hour to discuss this very issue. Well, the entitlements, as you know, and I hate that phrase, that suggests that the recipients are entitled to these benefits, was clever semantics when someone concocted that term to describe these programs. The entitlements are fixed in place by law unless there is action to address them by the Congress of the United States. And the point I made to President Bush back in July of last year is he should just walk away from that summitry, stop negotiating with the Democratic leadership, who were dragging their feet anyway, and say, look, I have come up with my own solution to the problem. My solution to the problem is I will not sign any appropriation bill that exceeds 1990 levels of funding. And the estimates are, if we took that approach with no tax increases, we'd be in balance in 3 years. But if he took that approach, take Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services, 75% of their budget is entitlements. Only 25% is discretionary spending. And if they were under a freeze like that, the Congress would have to turn around and take a long, hard look at the entitlement component of their departmental budget. And they would have to address that problem if the president was sustained on his vetoes, because they would have dried up all their discretionary spending in no time at all. And I think that's the only way that the president can exert that kind of influence, and it's the constitutional procedure. Wield that veto, as I told him. If you get rolled, you get rolled. But on the other hand, I was convinced then that we had the votes, and I'm still convinced we have the votes to sustain his vetoes. Well, I just came from a meeting with our leadership on the Republican side, and that issue came up. Frankly, I think it is a mistake for Republicans to talk about touching that bubble. Now, they have tried to portray that bubble as inequity for people in the, if you're an individual, $45,000 a year to $145,000 a year range. The fact of the matter is that person doesn't get to the 28% rate of taxation until he gets to $145,000. The bubble is in there, and I know it looks weird, but the bubble is in there to even out your percentage of total tax based upon your personal deduction, the amount of money you make in the 15% range, then the 28% range. And so no one actually pays 28% until he is out of the bubble. But because that looks, to the average person who doesn't understand it, looks like an inequity, the Democrats have seized on that, and they want to make that 33% rate permanent. Now, what that would mean is that no one still, that individual I cited, he is still paying under 28% until he hits $145,000. But then he would kick from 27.9% up to 33%. And it's a very substantial tax increase of a magnitude in the first year, they guesstimate, of about $45 billion. I think that Republicans, to the degree they are trying to pair that concept with, say, a reduction in capital gains to 15%, are moving in the wrong direction. Because the Democrats will not permit the Republicans to take it to 31%, say, and then incorporate a 15% capital gains rate. What the Democrats are talking about doing is taking it up to the 33% and then accepting President Bush's initial proposal to take the capital gains rate down to about 19.6%. I don't think it's a fair trade-off because they're still generating a whale of a lot more revenue. But in addition to that, then, they would clean up some of the entitlements. I mean, clean them up in terms of making them more politically palatable. And then we've blurred the distinction again, because if Republicans properly would object to that package, how's the average voter out there going to see the fundamental difference between 31% and a 15% capital gains rate versus 33% and a 19.6% capital gains rate if the adoption of the former means that you still have to rein in some of the expenditures? And we're not going to prevail as Republicans down here. But right now, I think there's a lot of confusion in the public perception as to where our parties are coming from. We are lacking some clear-cut signals to the voters, and the sad thing is, according to what the polls show right now, this is designed to hurt Republicans when we're already a minority. Let me mention one other thing quickly. I'll be 60 on November 3rd. In my lifetime, Republicans have only had this House, had this Congress, House and Senate, 4 years. And that last time was 1952 to 54. And I've said, why don't the voters try us? They might like us. Well, all I can say is from the standpoint of teachers' retirement, it's unquestionably better guaranteed in Social Security. Social Security is something that affects all seniors past 65, and Social Security is the hottest political potato probably when you talk to making any adjustments. But on the other hand, I will say this. In '83, when Congress acted to guarantee the solvency, you know, they put that provision that if you're making in other outside income after 65, $25,000 a year or more, then half of your benefits will be taxed. And kicking around on the Hill is a provision to lower that threshold. And I've told kids today, young people, and if your audience is primarily made up of young people college age, and they're after the boomer generation, while the expectation is that between 2015 and 2020, the surplus in that Social Security fund is going to be in the neighborhood of $13 trillion. That will only cover the boomers. And that's why IRA eligibility should be expanded for those coming after, because I think what you're going to see happen ultimately is Social Security benefits will be cut back until the poverty level, and finally it will be an acknowledged welfare program, and if you're below the poverty level, you'll be eligible. If not, you're going to have to provide for yourselves. So any of these retirement programs potentially down the line are in prospective jeopardy. Well, I was not all that pleased about putting troops on the ground, to be honest with you. I felt that that was a problem that could have been resolved from airstrikes, and maybe this sounds radical to your audience, but we have a capability of launching missiles with precision from the air that are beyond the reach of surface-to-air missiles. And I would have picked out a neutral target where no human habitation existed and demonstrated to Saddam Hussein what the capability is, and then told him he had 24 hours to get out of Kuwait, and if he didn't, we would start raining the bombs on key targets, and that would include his biological weapons facility, his chemical weapons facility, his nuclear research development area, all logistical and base camps, and to be honest with you, I'd have gone after Saddam Hussein himself, tried to take him out. You know, we missed taking Gaddafi out, but that strike that Reagan made on Libya at that time certainly caused Gaddafi to crawl back inside his shell. I know what he's talking about, and the fact of the matter is, I don't know that it's been absolutely verified, but the assumptions are there is a great deal of oil there, and we have traditionally enjoyed claim to those islands. Our State Department, for whatever reason, and they started this long, in fact, before there were evidences that the Soviet Union was changing internally, they were moving toward giving those islands away to the Soviet Union. I think we should stand up for our rights. I think we have an historic claim to those islands, and I think the Soviets have none. Well, unfortunately, the prospects at the present moment are very dim. It's interesting you mention that because I am carrying down to the President when I go down there a letter I wrote to him on May 9th of this year. And in that letter, one of the things I urged upon him was, by all means, don't deviate from read my lips, no new taxes, and start considering some of these creative alternatives. Maggie Thatcher has demonstrated the efficacy of privatization. And I said, sell Amtrak, sell TVA. I mean, there are so many areas of government involvement right now that could be privatized. We could make enormous economies. And I think, though, that you're not going to see any such initiative until there is a change in the composition of the Congress. And in that context, I'd remind you in conclusion of a quote by Lincoln. Lincoln made the statement that with public sentiment behind you, anything is possible, and without it, nothing. Therefore, he said, he who influences public sentiment performs a vastly more significant act than he who simply enacts statutes. Now, we had an eloquent person to create public sentiment in Ronald Reagan. George Bush is the first to concede he lacks that eloquence. But the media is playing, in my estimation, a most damaging role, because the media is creating a public sentiment, and that public sentiment is totally negative, and sad to say, it's anti-Republican. The offset, I think, is through the classroom, education, and students bothering to dig a little deeper than the superficialities of headline writing and, you know, their 30-minute bites on television, to arrive at an understanding of the facts, then to communicate that to friends, neighbors, and relatives, and then to get out to the polls and change the composition of the Congress and the course of our history. And I want to thank you, Cliff, for the opportunity to be here, and I apologize that I'm not there in person. Bye-bye now.